My name is Adam Biersted. I'm the Albert Ravenholt Curator of Danish American Culture here at the Museum of Danish America, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our Brown Bag Lunch for today. The Brown Bag Lunch series is sponsored by former board member of the museum, Dennis Anderson, and is a monthly speaker series where we have experts, local business people, people of all professions and backgrounds give talks about their expertise and about how their work connects to the museum's goals and our mission of Danish American culture. It's my pleasure today to welcome Kevin Henry. Kevin Henry is a collector of Danish ceramics and has been an invaluable consultant and help as we prepare our exhibit, Danish Ceramics Beyond Blue and White, which opens with a members preview tomorrow evening and opens to the public on Saturday, November 16th. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Okay, so here we are back in Elkhorn, and I have to start with a few details about my bio and a few disclaimers. So, I'm not from Iowa. I'm a native of the state of Ohio, and I live in Colorado. I'm not from Denmark, although my wife and I have visited Denmark many times, and we love Denmark. I'm not even Danish American. You know, my heritage is, I identify as Polish and Ukrainian American because that was my mother's background, and I was raised in that culture. So, and I'm not an art historian. I spent my whole career working in international humanitarian assistance and economic development, mostly focused in Africa, but also in Asia. So why am I here today to talk to you about Danish ceramics? Well, it happens that I'm a collector. I'm a very die-hard collector. I grew up in a part of Ohio that had a ceramic tradition, and so I connected to ceramics through the ceramics of my native state. But once I discovered Danish ceramics, I realized actually I had found something that was, you know, world class. You know, when you talk about 20th century Danish ceramics. And as I was starting to explore, and I was traveling frequently to Denmark at that time for my work, and I'd go into the flea markets and I started seeing this stuff. And one of the first workshops I discovered was Saxbo. So for most of you, you've probably never heard the name or you're not familiar. You know Royal Copenhagen, probably, you know Bingen Grundahl. But what I want to do today is convince you that the work produced by Saxbo from the very end of the 1920s into the mid to late 1960s was some of the most important work in the ceramic arts that came out of Denmark. And that the woman who was behind Saxbo, Nathalie Krebs, was truly a pioneer and a woman very much ahead of her time. So that's what I'm going to try to convince you of, and so I'll run through my presentation, but then I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. So, and I'm particularly pleased to be here this week in Elkhorn for the opening of the exhibition, Danish Ceramics Beyond Blue and White. When I found out that the museum wanted to do this, in fact, it was Dia in the back who first contacted me when she was in Adam's role as curator at the time. I said, this is what I've been waiting for. You know, someone in America to take Danish ceramics seriously and to want to do something to raise the profile. And I'm also happy that we have several visitors from Denmark with us today, from the Linnemann Schmidt family, whose parents and grandparents were the leaders, the creators behind another important Danish workshop, Pelshus, that you'll also see represented in the exhibition. So it's a pleasure for me to be here and kind of a special occasion because of the exhibition opening. So this is a photo of Nathalie Krebs. I'm going to tell you more about her. This is from late in her life, in the 1960s. So in the final years of the workshop, she's in the workshop in front of the kiln there. She was quite an imposing, a formidable woman. Let's just put it that way. She was born in 1895. Her father was a general. She grew up in Aarhus in the west of Denmark. Although her father was a general, there were 6 kids and not a lot of money, so the kids had to kind of make their own entertainment, and they were allowed to pursue their own interests by the parents. And very interestingly, Nathalie Krebs decided that chemistry was her passion, and that colors were, what she was really inspired by. And so for a woman, at that time, in 1913, she left home, went to Copenhagen to the university, and spent 6 years studying color chemistry. So that was, unusual at the time, and just maybe a first indication of, what a pioneer Nathalie Krebs was. On graduation, she went to work for Bing & Grøndal, which is, one of the 2 biggest Danish names as far as larger workshops or factories, did tableware, all of that stuff. But they also, in the early 20th century, also entered into the world of producing artistic stoneware. So she spent 10 years there working under, their experts to learn about glazing of all kinds, everything that Bing & Grøndal produced. But she sort of got a bit bored there, and she wanted to work with stoneware, which was sort of the rage, if you will, at that time in Denmark, largely inspired, largely coming from Japanese influence and the kind of passion that Europe had for all things Japanese at that time. And so she struck out on her own with another artist, Gunnar Nielsen, who would become, one of the biggest names in Scandinavian ceramics design, mostly known for his long time as the artistic director at Rörstrand in Sweden. So they struck out on their own. They actually took over the existing workshop of Patrick Nordstrom, who is one of the biggest names in Danish ceramics and a true pioneer, at Royal Copenhagen and then on his own in stoneware production. But then, after just 2 years, Gunnar Nielsen got an offer to be the artistic director of Rörstrand, which was a big deal. So he left, and then so there she is on her own, and she had to figure out what to do. And what she did was to go on for 40 years to lead one of the most important Danish ceramic workshops of all times. So these are a couple photos from my collection. One, a photo of the bottom with the mark from the very early time when the workshop was called Nielsen and Krebs. So I have just the names of the founders of the workshop. The bottom, that's a long story, but that's really the first piece of Saxbo I ever bought, and it's truly an exceptional example, which you can't fully appreciate in this photo of the glaze. It's like a turquoise peacock feather glaze. It's a beautiful bowl, but it's kind of, again, Nathalie Krebs was the person behind the glazes, and that's really what she was known for. But she had to find another designer because Gunnar Nielsen was the designer, and he left. And one of the first things she did was to hire a very young woman who hadn't even fully finished her studies at what was called the Kunsthandwerkskolen. So it was the school for training in the arts and crafts, and it produced a lot of the top ceramicists in Denmark for a period of 30 or 40 years. She actually ended up marrying one of her professors there, Olof Stehr-Nielsen. Her name was Eva Wilhelm originally. So this young woman in her early 20s came to work at Saxbo. Okay, you're not having a hard time hearing me? Okay, sorry. So she's a very young woman, started designing quite simple forms initially, but over a period, but she stayed on then, from the early 1930s until the workshop closed in 1960. And during that time, she was responsible for designing some of the most, she became one of the most important ceramics designers in Denmark over her life. So after Nielsen left, Saxbo, even from an early time period in the 1930s, won a lot of very important international competitions outside of Denmark. And then in 1938, Nathalie Krebs was able to move into a new purpose-built workshop for Saxbo, so moving out of the old Nordstrom workshop. And that building, which you'll see photos of later, is still standing. So this is a photo of the young Eva Stehr-Nielsen, considered the most important designer of Saxbo, and really kind of a partner for more than 30 years with Nathalie Krebs. She did not throw her own work. So, unlike some other important Danish ceramicists. So she was a designer, and then she did a lot of decoration on her works, but the glazes were from Nathalie Krebs, and the pots were thrown by a small group of about a half a dozen very skilled craftsmen that worked for Saxbo over the years. So in 1932, she actually came to Saxbo as a volunteer, and Nathalie Krebs did that. She brought in young students, young trainees. They did an apprentice. A few stayed, others went on to other workshops or eventually set up their own. So Eva Stehr-Nielsen came, she made simple things to start with, and eventually created some of the most iconic forms in Danish stoneware. And from 1932 to 1951, she was the sole resident designer at Saxbo. I'll talk about some of the visiting artists that came and went, but she was the only signing artist who was an employee of Saxbo for 20 years. This is one of her most iconic forms. You'll see a beautiful example in the exhibition in blue, the larger one, and it was in some of the images that the museum circulated for the exhibition. It's called the Split Pitcher, and it's one of the most recognizable pieces of Danish stoneware. And one of my other Saxbo-related projects was to be involved in the publication a couple years ago of a book. In fact, I'll pass this around. If you're interested, take a look. But this is the first book published on the Saxbo workshop, and it's in Danish. So if any of you, are fluent in Danish, you'll appreciate it particularly. But the cover of that book also has one of these split pictures on it. So I think everyone recognizes that this form is like one of the most recognizable and iconic pieces. And this is an example from my collection at home of that work. These are a few other examples, and you'll see, early Saxbo was, referred to as, functionalism. I mean, very sleek, simple designs, mostly monochromatic glazes. The glazes by Nathalie Krebs. In this case, these forms were mostly Nielsen. Some of them probably were actually designed by Gunnar Nylund during his brief tenure at the workshop. So this is kind of the early Saxbo style. These are other examples in one of my favorite glaze families, and Nathalie Krebs, and that book actually, in the back of the book, further in the back, there's a whole section on her glazes and identifying the different glazes. And so in this kind of these dark blues, there was a cobalt blue, there was a violet blue, there was an azure blue, so all of these different colors and subtle differences, but just very beautiful. And my photos, don't do justice, but when you see them in person, and the blue picture in the exhibition, you'll see is a very vibrant blue color. So this is another example. I like these off-white glazes. People think, oh, well, that's kind of boring, but very subtle. And again, you have these simple forms with these rather names like snow hair and eggshell, and all of these very different subtle variations on gray and off-white colors. Most of those, like in the back row, are forms designed by Nielsen. The two little pieces in front, the one, I guess, as you'll be looking at it on the right, is actually by Nielsen, and I'll talk about him later. The other one is by a female sculptor who was a visiting artist at Saxbo, Marta Hasted. Again, artists were attracted to Saxbo because Nathalie Krebs set very high quality standards and produced beautiful glazes, and it was the combination of those designs and glazes that Saxbo was known for. So Saxbo did, even though it had very few resident artists who were employees of the workshop, over the years it attracted some very important Danish artists to produce their work in stoneware at Saxbo. And I mentioned some of the names here. They won't mean much to most of you. Of course, the biggest name there is Axel Salto, who is considered, one of the great masters of Danish stoneware. And the museum is fortunate to have gotten several Salto pieces on loan from the Swedish Institute in Minneapolis. So you'll see those when you visit the exhibition. But the visiting artist who I feel is the most important in the history of Saxbo and is a personal favorite of mine is Nielsen. So this is an example of his work. He did heavy work, a very kind of sculptural kind of work with a lot of biblical motifs, some motifs from Greek and Roman mythology, others that are just sort of more symbolic kind of works. This one is one of my favorites, and again, it was the first piece of Gijs Nielsen I ever bought. And this has a glaze. It's a spectacular glaze in person. It's called malachite, is the name that Nathalie Krebs gave this glaze. And the theme is fertility. So you have on this side a farmer, a male farmer. You see a sheaf of something he's harvested, a shovel. On the other side of the vase is the female equivalent, you know, like a husband and wife farmers, and the vase he called fertility. These are other very typical examples of his work at Saxbo, again with very interesting motifs. The dark brown one is the story of St. Francis of Assisi, for example. You know, Nathalie Krebs glazes, you know, very typical of his work. You'll see one example of his work from Saxbo in the exhibition, and then you'll see he is best known for his years at and then production at Royal Copenhagen. So you'll see examples of his work also from Royal Copenhagen, and he's one of the artists featured in the exhibition. So he's, you know, a personal favorite of mine, and I think one of the big names. Interestingly, in the market, he's not given the kind of recognition that Axel Salto is. They were contemporaries and sort of rivals even. And it was largely because he drew heavily on religious motifs, on biblical motifs, and that just wasn't so popular in the market. But you know, he's a genius, and I think increasingly he'll be recognized as such. This is another example of a work by a visiting artist. Often these artists had, you know, training at the highest level in the fine arts in Denmark, at the Royal Academy often, sculptors. Gijs was more of a painter before he became a ceramic designer. But Eric Rahr, who designed this piece, which is in the museum's collection, and it came from my collection to the museum, is a very unusual example of his work, and very much shows kind of an inspiration of the style pioneered by Axel Salto at that time. But he was an example of one of these visiting artists. He was actually best known for making a smoking set. So this tobacco jar, again, to me, is one of the most recognizable pieces of Danish stoneware from that era. And it's in a glaze. I love this glaze also, which is a Nathalie Krebs glaze called bird feather. You know, so she had all of these names for these very complicated glazes that she developed. And this, the smoking sets were actually commissioned by what was at that time, and I think it still exists, one of the most important tobacco shops in Copenhagen, W.O. Larsen. So, and you'll find that mark on the bottom of the tobacco jar. But that's, to me, with the split, along with the split pitcher and this tobacco jar, are my two favorite forms, you know, probably in Danish stoneware, but certainly for Saxbo. They're just very recognizable figures.
Kind of come from the microphone again.
Oh, am I? Yeah.
I had to pull it up to you.
Pull it up.
Okay. Well,
I mean, do you want to speak to me?
Yes.
No, do you want to speak to us?
yes, Henrik, thank you.
We'll also,
You're right. One of the things I want to highlight about Nathalie Krebs is one of the most important things she did was to attract develop and promote women designers. Of course, Ava Stare Nielsen was the classic example, you know, coming in her early 20s to Saxbo, having no experience, you know, not even finishing her training. But then there were a whole series of women artists that Nathalie Krebs attracted and developed. Some came as trainees, some came, you know, later in their career. But after Ava Stare Nielsen, the most important of these female designers at Saxbo was Ida Sona Brun. And she started before the Second World War at Saxbo. Initially, she was a thrower. You know, she was throwing the pots on the wheel that were designed by Ava Stare Nielsen for the most part. And so she was very much behind the scenes, didn't get much recognition, but obviously she was a very skilled craftsperson who also had her own strong sense of design. And finally, around 1950, 1951, when the styles in ceramics in Europe and in Denmark were changing quite rapidly. There was something called the New Nordic Style. It wasn't so much the sleek, functional forms. They were heavier forms, more textured kind of forms. Saxbo decided they needed to change with the times, and an important part of that was elevating Ida Sona Brun to a signing artist. So throughout the 1950s, she was, you know, I would say a co-equal designer with Ava Stare Nielsen at Saxbo. She left in 1960 to go to Bing & Grøndal, and she continued to produce very good work. But you know, after Ida Sona Brun, there were, you know, at least two other important young women designers that came to Saxbo and were developed by Nathalie Krebs. One was a niece of hers. Her name is Kirsten Wiege, and she produced beautiful work. And then the last of Saxbo's signing artists, Lillian Binderup Jensen. So, and forgive my poor Danish pronunciations for those of you who speak the language. But this is Ida Sona Brun. This is later in her life, in the 1960s, when she had already left Saxbo and was at Bing & Grøndal. So those examples of her work in the photo are actually examples from her time at Bing & Grøndal. But I have a particular fondness for her work. There's a lot less of it out in the market than Ava Stare Nielsen, but I think she was a very talented and underrated designer. This is the nicest example of her work that I have in my collection. It's about a 14 or 15 inch pot with that bird feather glaze that Nathalie Krebs developed. So that actually, there's a photo of that pot in the Saxbo book that I'm passing around. So what you see behind there is the spread where that same pot, or it's not a unique piece, but there wouldn't have been many pieces like that, of that size thrown. So that's one of my favorite pieces. These are other examples of later Saxbo work by female artists, mostly from the 1950s, but also from the 1960s. So works by Ida Sona. There are a couple examples of Ava Stare Nielsen there, but Kirsten Wiege and Lillian Binderup Jensen. So you'll see the difference in the style from this later Saxbo work compared to those earlier works. This is actually Lillian, and she's still alive and with us. This is a photo in her home from a recent visit, and she's holding up what I consider to be one of her Saxbo masterpieces. She came to Saxbo as a young trainee right out of the Kunsthandwerkscholen, one of the last classes actually from that school. She stayed for 2 years. She was then at Bingen Grondal for a couple of years, and since then, and until quite recently, was still producing her own work in her own independent studio. So just a lovely person and a talented, and again, I think very underappreciated artist. So to kind of start to wrap up, I mean, there's it's nice to see finally a little bit of a lasting legacy for Saxbo, because this work was produced for 40 years and then it could have just completely disappeared, but it hasn't completely disappeared. So even though the workshop closed almost 50 years ago, first of all, it's one of the few workshops of that area where the building was preserved. So when the workshop closed, the municipality purchased it from Nathalie Krebs. Actually, they probably took it in lieu of all of her back taxes that hadn't been paid, sadly, because the workshop was struggling financially at that time. But the building is there, it was preserved, and as I'll talk about, the city, the municipality of Herlev, where it's located, has now agreed to convert it. It's being used as office space now. They're converting it to a youth training center and a Saxbo Museum. So there will actually be a Saxbo Museum, and I expect that to kind of, that'll probably take 2 or 3 years before they really have what they need to do to the building and then the installations. But I think that's a very exciting development. The first book on Saxbo is finally, produced, and I'm pleased to have been able to write a very short chapter in that book called Saxbo in America, to tell a little bit about the story of how Saxbo came to America and is still can be found in America. And then, of course, the exhibition that the Museum of Danish America is doing, I think is an important landmark, certainly for me. And there are a few examples of Saxbo, in the exhibition and in the museum's permanent collection, including that piece I showed you earlier by Eric Rahr. So that's a photo of kind of the rear side of the workshop, and that round structure is where the kiln was located, and so you see the chimney there. So it's really great that building has survived. So that was built in 1938 and now is going to be preserved as a museum. The book has been published. I attended the book launch in January of 2023. The book was published in December of 2022. And this is one of my co-authors at the book launch with a copy of the book. That's one example of a spread from the book, again showing Nathalie Krebs at work, inspecting, pieces as they came out, opening the kiln after a firing is always kind of the most exciting time for a potter, because you're never quite sure what you're going to get. It might be a brilliant success, or something might have just not at all turned out the way you would hope. And she was notorious for her high quality standards. So a lot of pieces were just destroyed when they were taken out of the kiln. Others were marked as second quality. And some of the second quality, I have second quality pieces in my own collection. Some of them are beautiful, and I keep looking for the flaw. But she saw something and didn't want it to be seen as first quality. This is the piece that you'll find in the exhibition, you know, with that very vibrant blue glaze. Even though the name of the exhibition is Beyond Blue and White, blue still plays an important role in the Danish ceramics world, and certainly in my collection, it's a favorite. So just to summarize, I mean, what I want you to just understand is that Saxbo as a workshop occupies a special place in the history of Danish ceramics. And I think it's absolutely one of the most important. And it was kind of the first really important independent workshop, because when stoneware, artistic stoneware, was first produced in Denmark, which was really only around the turn of the century. So in the very early 1900s, you know, the places where that had the resources and could experiment with that were the big makers like Royal Copenhagen and Bing and Grøndal. Well, Nathalie Krebs was one of the first to kind of leave that very safe environment, you know, with job security, and strike out on her own and set up an independent workshop. And the thing to know about Nathalie Krebs, the first thing to know is really the colors and the glazes, and not just the artistry behind that, but the chemistry behind it. And we still have, and I've seen personally some of her notebooks with all of these glaze formulas, you know, very complex formulas, you know, and she was constantly experimenting with the new glazes. So, you know, she went to university at a time when very few women were going to university. She studied in the sciences, which very few women were doing. She went to work in Bing and Grøndal at a time when, you know, most women in the kind of the, let's say from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, who worked in the ceramics world in Denmark were often called painting girls. You know, they were the ones who did the decoration. They got no credit for anything they did, you know, and they worked for very little money, okay? But, you know, in part thanks to people like Nathalie Krebs, you know, and to the Kunsthandwerksskolen, which produced a lot of incredible female artists, women started to take on a more important role and became signing artists, because that's the big deal. You know, if you're working in one of those big workshops, you know, you might produce beautiful works, but your signature wasn't necessarily on it. So she was really a pioneer in all of those ways, and she set very high standards, and from very early on, Saxbo was recognized internationally and won important prizes. You know, first, as I said, in the 1930s, you know, important exhibitions in Paris and Berlin, but then in the 1950s, they were a regular feature and won prizes several times at the Milan Triennales, which were sort of the showplace for the decorative arts in Europe at that time. So, that's it. That's me, actually, photo taken outside the Saxbo workshop, so you can still see that it's still standing and will soon be the site of a museum dedicated to Saxbo, but also something that Nathalie Krebs would really appreciate, a youth training center. So I think that's a really appropriate tribute to her legacy, and a good way of also preserving the legacy of that workshop. So, thank you. And Any questions that you have, I'd be happy to try to answer. Yeah, Robert.
The split picture, did others copy that shape?
Not exactly. I've never seen an identical, but some tried, and you have some similar forms. In fact, there's one example that I like. My second most famous picture is by Arne Bang, who was another very important Danish artist. And the museum has in the exhibition a very nice example of that came from my collection, and that's probably my second, but it's not an identical form, and I'm sure some people tried to copy it exactly because it was that, you know, iconic.
If they did that, it would have been after them straight away.
Who's made yours?
What's that?
Who has made yours?
Well, now my memory isn't so good, but I think I got one marked Carl Hellier. I'll send you a picture of it.
Send me a
I'll send
picture.
you it's in brown. It stands about this high. It
Well,
might be different, I don't know.
I mean, there are so many, every workshop, you know, did pictures, you know, and some are very mundane, you know, and some are very striking. And for me, the two that I find most striking, the museum has examples of both of those in the exhibition, and that's the Eva Nielsen and the Arne Bang one. But definitely many other workshops and artists did their versions. Yes, Cheyenne.
I'm gonna ask a quick question. You mentioned that the designers didn't throw their own pots usually, or maybe some of them did, but some of the ones that you spoke about. And perhaps this is a silly question, but did they design it from the beginning, like the shape that they wanted, and then told someone how they wanted them to throw it, and then placed it?
Well, you have a range, okay? So Eva Nielsen, for example, didn't throw. And in fact, you know, the throwers, even to this day, don't get the recognition they deserve. They weren't seen as artists. They were seen as just craftspeople, you know, frankly. And it was rare for someone to rise from that level to be recognized as an artist. But Eva Nielsen did very meticulous drawings of all of her works, everything done to scale. And I've seen some of those original drawings. So in her case, that was how it was done. And then she worked with Nathalie Krebs to select, well, what glaze would be best for this shape, and you know, all of that. Now, Ida Sona, who I think is the second most important resident artist at Saxbo, started as a thrower, and she threw to the end all of her own work. So the things that you find with her signature on it were not only designed by her, but they were thrown by her, or they were handmade by her. So you have that kind of thing. Then you have the big names, you know, people like, I can't tell you so much about Axel Salto, but I'm sure he didn't throw his own work, but I don't know how hands-on he was. But J.S. Nielsen definitely didn't throw his work, so he did the drawings. He did often like models for his work, because he was more of that. You know, a lot of them came from, as I said, fine arts kind of backgrounds. They were trained as painters, or they were trained as sculptors for the most part. You know, in the case of our friends here from the Linnemann Schmidt family and Paulshus, you know, Henrik and Thea's father, Annaliese's grandfather, was a trained sculptor, and he started his professional life as a portrait sculptor, and he went back to that after Paulshus. So they hired, you know, very skilled craftspeople who actually threw. And Henrik can...
Just sum it in a little bit. As thrower in Denmark, you could compare him to to an artisan, like a carpenter, a smith, or a furniture carpenter, and so on. They were trained like tradesmen, like artisans, and they were. That's what they were.
Yeah, we were not artists.
They were not artists. They were artisans.
But
Yeah.
they became very good at it in the end.
We had two on our father's workshop. They were master throwers. I mean, they were exceptionally good, but they were still artisans.
Yeah.
It was something we looked down on them. We admired them, but that's old tradition.
Right, but there is a bit of snobbery around this, because even to this day, I try with Saxbo to recognize, because later in Saxbo, you'll find on the bottom of the pots these kind of marks. You know, one is two big large dots, one is an X. Each of those was a thrower's mark. So you could identify who threw that pot. And so at least there was some recognition. But you know, people think it diminishes somehow the artistry to recognize. No, I'm just telling you, in Denmark, and even in that Saxbo book, there's virtually no information provided on the throwers. And like I said, Eva Ster Nielsen never threw a single pot. But you know, her name is everywhere. But you know, it was Ove Larsen, it was, I'm trying to think of some of the names, Sigmund Kjær. I mean, there were like a half a dozen who stayed usually for 5, 10, 20 years at Saxbo, and they were the ones that produced most of that work, the forms.
Off the cuff, Kevin.
Mhm.
We got 5 or 10 minutes on pencils. Off the cuff.
Uh-huh. What do you think?
I think it's 1 o'clock, so officially the Brown Bag Lunch is about to wrap up. But if you would like to speak a little bit about Pelshuis and compare it to Saxbo, you would be welcome to do that.
Okay. Very, very briefly, Henrik has put me on the spot. But, you know, I have about a half a dozen workshops that I really love and that I was attracted to from an early time, you know. And there's a particular line of pottery from Pelshuis, which is called, you know, the hare's fur, you know, which is a kind of glaze that has this very smooth, kind of silky look, and again, usually monochromatic. I started seeing this. And so then I started digging into it, and, you know, the story of Pelshuis is a fascinating one, and Henrik and the rest of the family can tell you more, but basically, you know, Denmark, like many other countries in Europe, suffered greatly during the Second World War. And so a lot of people, including Per and Annelies Linnemann-Schmidt, needed to figure out how to make a living. I mean, because he was a sculptor, but you know, commissions probably at that time for sculpture were few and far between. And there's a story behind it, but essentially Pelshuis came out of that imperative. They had 3 children, you know, born essentially during those war years. They had to figure out a way to support their family, and they created what is, I think, one of the best examples of not just an artistic stoneware workshop, but a successful business, you know. And the business side was mostly run by Annelies, you know, and Per was the primary designer with his training as a sculptor. And, you know, that went on. So basically from the late 1940s until the late 1960s, when at Christmas time in 1969, Annelies was tragically killed in an automobile accident. And as the family has told me the story, she had packed up the last of the Christmas shipments, you know, at the workshop, and was driving home to the farm where the family had moved, and had an accident and died very shortly thereafter. And Per tried to keep the whole enterprise going, and he did so for a few years, but as far as I can see, the last dated or signed piece of Pelsus I've seen is 1971. The workshop, I think, officially closed in 1972, and then after that, Per went back. He had the farm to run, the family farm, but then he took commissions again as a sculptor, and so that's how he finished out you know, his life as an artist. He started as a sculptor, was a stoneware designer for you know, 30 years. And
autodidact ceramist.
pardon?
Autodidact ceramist.
Yeah, right. His training was as an academically trained sculptor at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. So he didn't learn anything about ceramics then, which again, you know, all the decorative arts were considered kind of a second tier of the arts, you know, and it was only painting and sculpture that were considered fine arts. So that's a 5-minute version, and when you visit the exhibition, you'll see some nice examples of work from the family's collection that are now here at the museum. So, thank you.
Perfect. For more on Pelsus, I once again would like to invite everyone to visit the exhibition when it opens to the public on November 16th. If you're live, that's this Saturday. Or to keep an eye out for future content, including the April issue of our Moda Members Magazine. Once again, I would like to thank Kevin for giving the talk today. If you were live, in our live audience, I'd like to thank you as well for attending, and to remind you that this is part of the promotion and opening of our exhibit, Danish Ceramics Beyond Blue and White, which will open with a members-only reception tomorrow evening, and then open to the general public on Saturday. If you're watching the recording, the exhibit will be on view until April 2026, so I hope you'll stop by the museum to come visit it sometime in there. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.
You see, now I dressed up for this event. Normally I dress down.